للخير هيا بنا نلقاه في يومنا يا سادتي يا كرام سيروا لنيل المنى للخير هيا بنا نلقاه في يومنا يا سادتي يا كرام سيروا لنيل المنى سيروا لنيل المنى.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه الطيبين الطاهرين. We start with the name of Allah. We praise and thank Allah for the givings He gave without Allah being obligated to do anything, without Allah being obligated to give anything. And we ask Allah to raise the rank of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the ranks of his wives, believing relatives, companions, and those who follow them sincerely until Judgment Day. In the previous lesson, we were talking about those matters that necessitate a ghusl, the things that will occur to a person, male or female, after which one would be obligated to perform the purificatory bath, the full body rinse, before they would be able to pray. Among these matters are sexual intercourse, ejaculation, the termination of the menses when a woman's menstrual cycle ends, the termination of postpartum bleeding, and childbirth itself. God willing, we will continue mentioning some matters, additional matters that the Sheikh rahimahullah talked about in his book, in his explanation of the summary of Abdullah that pertain to this subject matter. He said that among the judgments that pertain to the menstrual bleeding is that the woman would only see it at approximately 9 lunar years. That is, if she was 7 years old or 8 years old or 8.5 years old by the lunar calendar, and she began to bleed from her vagina, then this would not be considered menstrual bleeding. However, if she completed 9 lunar years of age and she bled, then she would consider this menstrual bleeding. And we talked about previously that it could even precede her 9th birthday by a short period, and that is what is less than 16 days. So if she began to bleed before her 9th birthday by what is less than 16 days, then she would also consider this menstrual bleeding. Then he mentioned that when a woman does see this menstrual bleeding, if she bleeds at a time where it's possible that it would be counted as menstrual blood, then she would avoid certain matters. She would avoid fasting. She doesn't fast. A woman is prohibited from fasting, the obligatory fasting or the optional fasting during her menstrual bleeding time. Likewise, she would not pray. The woman is prohibited from praying while she is bleeding her menstrual blood, while she is in a state of menses. And likewise, sexual intercourse. She does not perform sexual intercourse. She does not allow her husband to have sexual intercourse with her, nor would the slave woman who is in her menstrual cycle allow for her master to have intercourse with her. And there are other matters that she is prohibited from doing that will be mentioned in a section specifically for that. He mentioned that the woman who began to see this menstrual blood, we talked about the fact that the minimum menstrual bleeding would be 24 hours. So if she bled and it stopped, the blood cut off before the completion of 24 hours, then in this case, she would consider that it wasn't menstrual bleeding. What happens? She starts to bleed, so then she considers it menstrual blood. Then, if the blood stopped, if the bleeding stopped before reaching 24 hours, then she would consider that it was not menstrual bleeding, as if it wasn't menstrual bleeding. So then she would make istinja, and she would make up whatever deeds that whatever obligations she left out due to her considering that blood the blood of menses. So if she left out some prayers because of that bleeding, considering that it was menstrual bleeding and that she was actually prohibited to pray, prohibited from praying for that duration of time, then she would make up those prayers. And likewise, fasting, if she skipped fasting because of that bleeding, then she would go and make up that fasting. Then, if the bleeding started again within the scope of 15 days from the first bleeding, from the beginning of the first bleeding, then she would consider that it's still menstrual blood. She would consider that it is still menstrual blood. And she would observe this matter until it completed 24 hours, so that she would consider that it was, in fact, menstrual blood. If that bleeding started again and then it stopped again before the completion of 24 hours, then she would do like the first time. She would make istinja. She would make up the prayer and fasting that she had left out because she considered that bleeding also among the menstrual bleeding. Then, if within the scope of 15 days, the bleeding reached an overall time of 24 hours, then she would consider all of that from the beginning until at least the time that it reached 24 hours as menstrual bleeding. She would consider it all menstrual bleeding. Then, in this case, now that this blood has been considered menstrual bleeding, she would make up whatever fasting she missed due to that bleeding, but she would not make up the prayers. She would not make up the prayers that she missed during that time, the prayers that she skipped because she was considering that bleeding menstrual blood. So the prayers that she skipped and during the time of bleeding before it reached 24 hours, if it stopped before reaching 24 hours, she's not considering this menstrual blood yet, so she would make up those prayers. But once the bleeding reached 24 hours, even if it was because of numerous times of bleeding that were interrupted, that added up to 24 hours within the scope of 15 days, then she is now considered this blood menstrual bleeding. She's certain that it was menstrual bleeding. So then she would not go back and make up those prayers that she had missed. Then, of course, once this bleeding is considered menstrual blood, then after this menstrual bleeding was terminated, then she would not just make istinja afterwards to pray, rather she would make a ghusl, she would make a purificatory bath, a full body rinse with the correct intention accompanying it at its beginning, and complete that before she would be permitted to pray. Likewise, among the judgments that are related to this is that when this bleeding occurred in a time where it's possible for it to be considered menstrual blood, and it began, so she considered it menstrual bleeding, and then it stopped before completing 24 hours of blood. So she considered that it was not menstrual bleeding at that point, and she started to make up prayers and make up fasting. And then this bleeding came back, and so she considered it menstrual blood. And then it terminated before uh, reaching a full 24 hours within the scope of 15 days, added with the bleeding that occurred before. And so she stopped praying and fasting for that period of time and having sexual intercourse. Then the bleeding stopped again before reaching 24 hours, like this. If during that period of time, when she was not bleeding, where she went back to fasting and praying and having sexual intercourse, if she went back to doing those things during those interruptions in the bleeding, then later it became clear to her that actually all of that was menstrual bleeding, and all of that duration of time was due to menses. It was considered among her menstrual cycle. Then she would not be considered sinful for the sexual intercourse, for example, that she had during that time, because of her basing the judgment on what is apparent. So, because the bleeding stopped before completing 24 hours, then she considered that it was not menses. So she would go back to fasting, go back to praying, and possibly have sexual intercourse because she did not believe, and based on what was apparent, that she was actually in a state of menses. It wasn't confirmed for her yet. So then she would not be sinful for that sexual intercourse that she had for that period of time. Then the Sheikh mentioned that the termination, the completion, or the termination of the menstrual bleeding is known by the woman if she put a piece of cotton in her vagina and then she brought it out and it was actually white at that point, then she would know that the blood has terminated, that the bleeding has terminated, and that it is not an obligation for her to check every hour, for example, or every short period of time to be certain that she is clean. After the author completed talking about those additional matters pertaining to the menstrual bleeding, he returned to the subject of the purificatory bath itself, and he mentioned the integrals of the purificatory bath. The integrals of the purificatory bath are only two matters. One is the intention, and the other is to wash the entire body. That is, for one to rinse, to make water flow over all of the hair and skin of one's entire body. As for the intention, it is sufficient if one made the intention to remove the major ritual impurity. Likewise, if one made the intention for the obligatory ghusl, this would be sufficient for the validity of one's ghusl. Or if they made the intention to do what makes the prayer permissible, or they made the intention to do what makes another deed that requires the removal of major ritual impurity permissible. So if a person intended to do what makes performing at tawaf permissible, for example, because tawaf, like prayer, it requires one to be clear of the two states of ritual impurity, the major and the minor. So if a person made the intention to do what makes the prayer permissible, he made the intention to do what makes the tawaf permissible, or any other deed that requires the removal of major ritual impurity for its permissibility permissible, then this would also suffice for the intention when performing the ghusl. As for the intention being at the beginning of the deed, The ghusl, the full body rinse, one matter. If a person made the intention merely to make the ghusl, then this would not be sufficient because the ghusl, it means washing and it does not necessitate the meaning of removing the ritual impurity. So for ghusl, when a person wants to perform the obligatory ghusl so that they can pray, then they should make the intention for the obligatory ghusl if they want to use that expression and not merely the intention of ghusl. Uh, if the individual, when rinsing himself off, when doing this full body wash, in his heart, his aim for doing that was to pray or to make the prayer permissible, something occurred to him or her that requires a ghusl for the permissibility of the prayer. And so they're in the shower, for example, and they're doing that because they want to pray. So in their heart, there is an intention that they are doing what makes the prayer permissible. So a person should be mindful about that. Like we talked about for the wudu, that the intention is an aim of doing something in the heart that is simultaneous with the deed, with the first part of the deed. And in mentioning that, it should be known that because there is no obligation in performing the purificatory bath, the obligatory ghusl, for one to start with one organ over another, then whatever part of the body the person begins to wash first, if he makes the intention to perform the obligatory ghusl during the first washing of that body part, then that would suffice. In this, wudu and ghusl differ somewhat. As far as wudu is concerned, we mentioned that the Prophet ﷺ, he taught his nation, ibda'u bima bada Allahu bi, to start with what Allah the Exalted started with. And since Allah the Exalted in the verse of the Quran pertaining to wudu started by saying, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu idha qumtum ila salati fawsilu wujuhakum. That he started in this verse saying, O you who believe, if you stood for the prayer, then wash your faces until the end of the verse. So, because the first organ mentioned in this verse to be washed is the face, and since the Prophet ﷺ ordered his nation to start with what Allah started with, then for wudu, the intention must be with the first washing of the face. As for ghusl, there is no obligatory order to it. So whether a person started by washing his face first, or his hands first, or even his feet, or if he washed his front or his back first, all of that would be valid. So wherever the person began to wash first, if they established the intention of in their heart during that first washing, whether it was his face or his hands or his feet or his back or his front, then that would be sufficient for establishing the intention during the first part of the washing, the first washing. Then the person would rinse the whole body. They would make water flow over the whole body. They need to reach all of the hair and all of the skin, and they must reach what is apparent of the hair and what the hair conceals of skin. So, unlike wudu, one's thick beard, a man's thick beard, does not excuse him from reaching the skin underneath that is concealed by that hair. Rather, whatever part of his body that contained a thick patch of hair, he would need to make sure that the water reached all that hair and the skin that is concealed by that hair. And as for the mouth, it is not obligatory for one to wash the inside of their mouth for ghusl. And it's not obligatory for one to wash the inside of their nose to inhale or bring water up into their nostril for the validity of the ghusl, nor is it obligatory for one to wash their eyeball, the surface of their eye, for the validity of the ghusl. Rather, one must reach all that is apparent of the body. If an individual, for example, was fat and he or she had some layers of skin that overlapped on top of each other, then they would make sure that the water reached the skin that is in between, for example. Or likewise, a person, if they had a big chest, for example, and so some of their chest overlapped some of their belly, for example, then they would make sure that the water reached all of that skin that is in between. This is what the person has to do when it comes to making the water reach their whole body. They make sure that it flows on all of the surface of their body, all of the hair and skin, even if the hair was thick. Then the author, may Allah the Exalted have mercy on him, he wrapped up this section saying that it is extremely important for one to pay due attention with performing the wudu and the ghusl. And this is because the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "At-tuhuru shatrul iman." So this indicates that purification is an extremely important part of the religion. And this hadith, it's an authentic hadith narrated by Imam Muslim. The Sheikh, he continued saying that the person who does not perfect his wudu does not truly get the maximum reward for his prayer. And for one to pay due attention and perfect one's wudu, then this would increase the rewardability of his prayer overall. Thus, the one who does not perform the complete and perfect wudu would not acquire the maximum reward for the prayer that he performed. So this shows the importance of purification, the importance of purification, whether from wudu or ghusl, in acquiring reward for the prayer itself. And this does not only include the obligations, although the obligations are the most important matters. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that Allah the Exalted said, وَمَا تَقَرَّبَ إِلَيَّ عَبْدِي بِشَيْءٍ أَحَبَّ إِلَيَّ مِمَّا افْتَرَضْتُ عَلَيْهِ. That Allah the Exalted revealed to the Prophet that my slave does not gain a higher status with me with any deed more acceptable to me than what I made obligatory upon him. So performing the obligations is the most important, more important than the optional matters. However, if one wants to acquire the maximum reward for the prayer, then they should perform the obligations, and they should also learn those optional matters pertaining to the prayer, whether it was, the optional matters pertaining to the wudu. They perform the wudu, and they learn the optional matters pertaining to the wudu and perform those as well. And they learn the ghusl, how to perform the integrals of ghusl, and they learn and perform the optional matters pertaining to the ghusl. Then in this way, then they would have not just a valid purification, but a perfect purification. And because of the perfection of their purification, the reward of their prayer would increase, insha'Allah ta'ala. And then if they performed the perfect purification and the perfect prayer, then this would be a reason for an enormous amount of goodness, whether that was having their small sins forgiven, and likewise for one to do that, for one to perform the purification and prayer and pray as the Prophet himself, alayhi salatu wasalam, used to pray, not only fulfilling the obligations, not only fulfilling the conditions, not only avoiding the invalidators, but also adding to that the optional aspects of the prayer that would perfect the prayer, would make it in its most perfect forms, then this, inshallah, would be a reason for a person to stop sinning. And for one of us to stop sinning means that they would be counted among the pious, and this is among the best statuses that we could reach. May Allah the Exalted make us among those who reach the status of piety and are steadfast and firmly grounded in that state, so that we will become truly among the very thankful slaves of Allah the Exalted. And may Allah the Exalted inspire us to do that and to perform additional deeds until we reach the status of high piety. Ameen. Walhamdulillah wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
قلوبنا هابت بذكر الله 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 قلوبنا هابت بذكر الله 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 قلوبنا هابت بذكر الله 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 قلوبنا
أتيناك بالفقر يا ذا الغنى وأنت الذي لم تزل محسنا فرحا ويسر لنا سبيل الرشاد وجد بالهنا الله يا الله يا الله يا الله الله يا الله يا كربنا فالعنا قد دنا أنزل كربنا فالعنا قد دنا أنلنا المنى أغننا واحمنا الله يا الله وهون أسانا ولا تخزنا وهون أسانا ولا تخزنا فقد بات فينا الأسى محزنا اغتنى بالهدى واعتنى فؤاد اغتنى بالهدى واعتنى ولكن ظهري بحمل حنى